Okay, today I want to talk about how to deconstruct personal values that you have inherited. This is just a standalone thing, but I am in the middle of doing this series on personal values. The first video we did was on what it feels like to lack a personal value system or to lack a conscious connection to your personal value system. And the second video was on how to build your own personal value system. And so today's video is sort of the inverse of that, which is how to deconstruct a personal value system that you inherited. And it's important to understand that you don't need to actually consciously believe in anything to inherit something. That's kind of the trap, is that most people associate inheritance with tradition or religion or ideology, as though only those raised in explicit systems of belief were shaped by them. But the truth is, everybody inherits. A value doesn't need to be taught directly or explicitly in order to take root inside of you. A value only needs to be repeated enough in the right context to feel like common sense. You absorb this in silence, in the look that somebody gives you when you disappoint them, in the way that your family actually handles conflict, in what no one around you is allowed to say out loud. All these things can shape what you inherit as a value system. You probably don't remember choosing it. You just wake up one day and realize that it governs how you interpret risk, how you assign guilt to yourself and to people in your life, how you navigate love. It's already installed. And when your life starts to fracture under stress, you realize you're not just suffering, you're obeying something. That's when the problem begins. That's when your inherited values start to fail. And if they're invisible to you, then it just feels like your life is falling apart and you have no control. And that's really scary. And I've been there more than a few times. The most disorienting moral experience isn't failing to live up to your values. You can deal with that. It's living by them and still suffering. You try to be loyal and you get betrayed. You choose stability and you just end up stagnant. You pursue independence and you just find yourself isolated. The story that you were following stops working, but you can't name what it was or why you trusted it in the first place. So, in typical fashion, let's dig into the history of ideas to help guide us in finding a solution to this. The first philosopher that I want to look at is one of my favorite philosophers of all time, David Hume. David Hume argued that morality is rooted in custom, which is kind of indisputable, right? We feel our way into structure. Society doesn't give us rational proof of its norms. Society gives us repetition. Society gives us ritual. Society gives us aesthetic coherence and rituals of compliance. That's what makes inherited values so sticky, that they're not just held in the intellect. There are open doors to participate and be formed by these norms at almost every juncture in life, at almost every touch point in life where you make contact with society. It is asking you to participate in its norms. It doesn't need to prove them or justify them or explain them. These social values are wired into judgment and taste and instinct. Even when you reject them, you're still reacting to them. And that's not freedom. That's reversal. This is the first stage of value authorship, not invention, but excavation. And this leads us to the fantasy of the blank slate, because most people, when they begin to deconstruct their personal value system, they assume that they're clearing the ground to start fresh. They strip away the beliefs that they were raised with. They make fun of their upbringing. they discard institutions, and they rename their commitments, and they kind of flaunt pointedly transgressive behaviors, thoughts, and attitudes, and but what they do is they rarely examine how they actually learned to see through their value system, and to attempt to directly transform this through reconditioning. And as long as your perceptual framework remains inherited, then your rebellion is just decorative. Honestly, I see this a lot in the like the Christian deconstruction community. Not to like dip my toe into that water at all, but like a lot of people are still very shaped by those attitudes. You see people that used to be, for example, like deeply religious, that then move out of that context, are still shaped by some of those attitudes and emotional cadences, and are still kind of judgmental, and are still expressing the same basic religious personality type, but dressed up in a rebellious way, are still basically looking for ways to judge and exclude, but and mock and practice attachments and belonging, and all of that through the practice of exclusion. Like, just look at it. It's very, very interesting social phenomenon. But that's like neither here nor there. The point is that trying to undo the superficial aspects of our personal value system can often masquerade as true transformation when our perspective remains fundamentally the same, and we don't even touch the true value system that we've actually inherited. Right. So as long as your perceptual framework, which is the fundamental value system, remains inherited, then that rebellion against any kind of previous value system is just ornamental. And so now we move into another philosopher, Iris Murdoch. Iris Murdoch's critique of moral psychology really cuts directly into this illusion of transformation when only addressing the superficial. So Murdoch argues that moral freedom is not found in choosing your values from scratch, but in seeing differently. You don't change your values by asserting new values, which doesn't totally sound right or make sense. But Murdoch's making a profound point, which is that you change your values by changing your attention. You change your values by changing what you notice. You change your values by changing what you treat as morally salient and relevant. What you allow to matter is a choice. It's a behavior. And I like this because I feel like I like to think of myself as a behaviorist. And so this idea that your personal values isn't just something that you reorganize in your mind, but it's something that can only be conditioned through behavior change. This I like. This feels like how we change things meaningfully in the rest of our lives too. It makes making personal value system modifications into behavioral changes makes those kinds of changes as hard as every other kind of change we want to make, right? So if we say, well, I want to change my personal values, so now I'm going to decide to believe this instead of that. It's like, well, that was easy. Well, nothing in life tends to come that easy. If you want to change any other aspect of yourself, typically you have to go through some kind of friction, and it's the friction that comes with having to act differently. All of that discomfort to act differently, that it's rehabituation. It's the friction of rehabituation that makes most change hard. So personal value system modification, or deconstructing your previous personal value system, should be hard. We should be looking for, how do I make this real? Through the friction of behavioral rehabituation. So inherited values, they don't just tell what you believe, they train you in what to ignore in life. So even when you rewrite your belief system, if you're still attending to the same cues and seeking the same kinds of validation and fearing the same kinds of disapproval, you're still inside the structure. You've changed the paint, not the walls. So I put together a little 5 steps for deconstructing your inherited values. This is not meant to be any kind of authoritative or meaningfully significant guide. This is just something that I found personally helpful as a framework to help you walk through it. Because deconstruction doesn't begin with what you reject. It begins with what you obey without noticing. The goal isn't to erase what you inherited. It's to understand how it functions. Because you don't need to renounce your upbringing to question the structure that it gave you. You just need to surface what was previously implied and examine it in plain terms. But excavating it and translating it from the inarticulate to the spoken requires, I think, this process or something like it. So, a structurally grounded deconstruction includes these things. Number 1, you trace the origin of your personal values. So you name where the value came from, not just the system, the religion, the family, the education, but the specific moments that shaped your interpretation of that system. What praise or punishment was attached to it? What behavior did it authorize? So trace the origin of your personal value or your feeling or your thought or whatever. If you're acting or behaving or feeling in a way that that doesn't feel in alignment with your current explicit value system, then you trace the origin of that feeling. Where did this come from? Number 2, you articulate the implicit contract of this value. So every inherited value includes a deal. If you do X, then you'll be safe, you'll be good, you'll be acceptable. So make that contract explicit. What did the value promise you? And then what did it demand of you? What bargain did you make? What exchange are you making every day with the universe? Right? So trace the origin, articulate the implicit contract. Number 3, observe the obedience reflex inside of you. Observe the obedience reflex. So where do you feel guilt or shame or anxiety for doing nothing wrong? That's usually where an inherited value is still running. Look for these behavioral patterns that feel compulsory but are no longer intelligible. So trace the origin, articulate the implicit contracts, observe the obedience reflex. Number 4, apply counterfactual pressure. What does this mean? This means that you ask the question, if I had been raised in a different context, would I still hold this value? Would it still feel morally urgent, or would it be invisible to me? And then 5, test it for structural integrity. So hold that value up to contradiction. What happens when it collides with your current context or your current priorities? Does it clarify or does it confuse? Does it generate coherence or compliance? So again, those 5 are, when you have a personal value or a feeling or experience that doesn't feel aligned with you, you ask, you identify and you ask. You trace the origin, you articulate the implicit contract, you observe the obedience reflex, you apply counterfactual pressure, and you test for structural integrity. Because deconstruction doesn't require disowning what formed you, because that's part of your story, for better or worse. But it does require that every value you keep is chosen twice, once by exposure and again by deliberate return. Anything less is just inherited by inertia. So, how do we wrap this up? Inherited values feel like your own because they live inside your perception. They don't appear to you as rules. The values you inherit don't appear as values. They don't appear as rules that you're following. They appear as just what feels right. They have the advantage of feeling like intuition. They have the advantage of feeling like you. That's what makes them so difficult to question and so hard to leave. This is the contradiction at the heart of modern moral agency. You want to author your own values, but you're still using inherited tools to measure coherence and obedience in your life. You want freedom from the past, but you're still filtering your decisions through its expectations. Even your rejection of your past personal value system is structured by what you were taught to fear. You don't need to reject everything you inherited, but you do need to examine where your judgment came from. Even the desire to reject your past came from somewhere. Where did that come from? What shaped your sense of significance and how that continues to govern what you pursue and what you avoid? Because until you interrogate the structure of your perception, you're not making choices. You're reenacting them with better language and worse illusions.